everybody, good evening. Come on, good evening. So lovely to be here with you on what was a quite strange weather, actually. I was out there thinking it was nice and sunny and then suddenly got rained on. But thank you for coming and joining us on a beautiful summer evening. My name's Gemma Milne. I'm delighted to be here with Kevin to help him launch this wonderful book here in Edinburgh. I was so lucky that I not only got to read this nice and early because I was helping do a little bit of editing on the chapters, but then got to read the whole thing super early. One of the benefits of being a writer is you get to read other writing for everyone else does. And then getting asked to come here and do this meant I got to read it again even closer. So I feel like I'm quite intimately attached to this book in many ways. So let me tell you a little bit about Kevin and we'll get into a bit of a discussion about it. So Kevin is a writer and a researcher whose work explores the intersection of data and identity. He is a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh Business School, and he's director of the Gender and Sexuality Data Lab right here. He's the author of his first book, Queer Data, Using Gender, Sex and Sexuality Data for Action, which we're going to talk a little bit about. And of course, his new book, launching today, Rainbow Trap, Queer Lives, Classifications and Danger of Inclusion. Now, this is an absolutely wonderful book that's got 6 systems that it unpacks that I'm going to read through for those who haven't already taken a look at this book or flipped through it yet. And this, I want to illustrate this because of the breadth that you managed to do with this book. The 6 systems that you look at are police and the recording of hate crimes, dating apps and digital desire, outness in the film and TV industry, borders and LGBTQ asylum seekers, health and fitness activities, and DEI initiatives in the workplace. And one of the things I think about this book is your writing is so urgent and polemic, but it's also really generous and personal in its writing. And I think it's a wonderful gift that you give everyone. So please join me in giving him a huge welcome and round of applause and help us launch Rainbow Trap here tonight.
Thank
you. So Kevin, let's start. What is a rainbow trap?
I'm sure this is the question I'm going to be asked time and time again over the next few years. So rainbow trap is a term I use to describe a particular concept. And for me, a rainbow trap is what happens when LGBTQ communities or any marginalized, minoritized group are brought into systems, so organizations, institutions, data systems that previously kept them on the outside. But part of the bargain for being invited in is you have to satisfy certain criteria. So across those 6 chapters you kind of perfectly covered, a look at what do LGBTQ communities have to give up in order to access these systems. So to be counted in hate crime reporting, to be visible on a dating app, to be part of your work's DEI initiative, what do you have to give up in return? So the book is basically a long critique of inclusion, of certain types of inclusion, thinking critically about what inclusion means, who is included and who's not included. And for me, Rainbow Trap kind of encapsulates that kind of dark side or that kind of hidden harms of being counted and being included. So I was really inspired by a lot of the kind of, I work in diversity and inclusion work, a lot of my research is around how organisations count and categorise marginalised groups in a variety of ways. I just thought something is a bit off here, something isn't working in terms of this kind of version of inclusion we're being sold. So rainbow trap is the term I use to describe kind of what's happening just under the surface when these groups are being brought in.
Amazing. Now, before we kind of get into some more of the details of the book, I would love for you to give a little bit of context because Queer Data came out, I think it was 3 years ago, you said that Queer Data came out, and you've been all over the place, not just promoting that book, but doing the work that comes off the back of putting out an intervention like that into the world. And I'm curious about why you then decided to write Rainbow Trap off the back of not just your previous work, but I guess what you learned along the way from the response to that book and the kind of interventions that you've been a part of as a result.
Yeah, so Queer Data was my first book. I'd never written a book before. It came out in 2022. I had no idea how it would be received. I had no idea if anybody would read it. So it was a huge, really overwhelming experience to see how far and wide that book went. It's taken me around the world to speak about LGBTQ data with a range of different communities and audiences. And the book, very simply, the first book, looked at how do we collect, analyse and use data about gender, sex and sexuality, in particular for LGBTQ communities. In many regards, it was a bit of a 101. How do we design surveys? How do we do meaningful data analysis? How do we do nice bar charts? Quite a lot of it was quite explanatory, but it did seem to kind of fit this need to kind of talk through how do we do this work meaningfully. But as I was doing lots of events, lots of talks around the book, I did become a bit skeptical maybe about what I'd written. If I was to go back now, I probably wouldn't write the same book 3 years on. I think I was maybe overly optimistic in terms of the benefits of being counted, the benefits of being recognised by these data systems. I was often surprised when I would do talks with audiences, when I'd speak to kind of LGBTQ groups and they'd be really enthusiastic about sharing their data with the state, about sharing their data with the police, with a healthcare provider. And I thought there's something a little bit off here, this enthusiasm to disclose information about your life, your experience, with organisations and institutions that don't often have your best interests at heart. So I became increasingly sceptical about the benefits of being counted, the benefits of being included. So I wanted to write a book that kind of maybe countered some of what I wrote in queer data, but also adopted a really different approach. So the book takes a kind of horizontal tour through these 6 different systems. It's not a deep dive into any one particular sector or industry, but by doing that, I wanted to show that whether you're designing a dating app or whether you're reporting a hate crime to the police, there's certain ideas about categories, classifications and labels that kind of resonate across these seemingly distinct and different sectors. So I wanted the book, ideally, that you could pick up if you were super interested in dating apps, and then you'd read on a few chapters and end up learning about how LGBTQ asylum seekers are categorised at the border, or how a gym manager is discerning who is a woman or a man in terms of being let into a changing room. That kind of horizontal journey through different systems. So my hope is, yeah, folk will learn something new and maybe leave a little bit more critical about inclusion and being counted as well.
So let's go into some of the examples or some of the details of this book without giving away spoilers, because we want lots of books to be sold, everyone to read them in their own time and to gift them to all your friends. But one of the terms that you use throughout the book, which I think is it's a simple term, but it does a lot of work. Someone once told me that term's called a suitcase term, and I think that's a really cool way of talking about it. But anyway, you use the term box breakers. And you use this to kind of help contextualise this argument. So I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of information about this and maybe give us a worked example of one of these box breakers.
Yeah, so in the introduction I introduced this idea of a box breaker, so somebody who breaks boxes, building on a long history of kind of scholars, activists, and particularly people like Lawrence Ashley in Canada doing some amazing work in a similar space. For me, a box breaker, it means 2 things. So it's somebody who looks at a list of available options on a survey or a drop-down menu for gender, for sex, for sexuality, and they go, none of those options speak to me. I don't identify as straight, as gay, as bi, as trans. I'm not fitting into the options available to me. So that's the first aspect of a box breaker. But the second aspect, as I write about in the book, I think is even more interesting. Because for me, a box breaker is somebody when forced into the system, so when you're forced to choose a sexuality or a gender that doesn't reflect who you are, actually when you're pushed into the system, you end up breaking the entire system you're forced into, because you're incongruous, you don't fit, you're visibly out of place in that system. And what's really interesting about a box breaker is in their presence, they actually end up kind of exposing the charade of the entire classification system. So one example, and that kind of entry point to this, was around the census. So anybody in the room who's kind of heard me speak before, has read any of my writing, you'll be familiar that I'm a total geek for the census, about the design of sexuality questions, gender questions. But again, in Scotland, there was a census in Scotland a few years ago. Something just didn't quite sit right about how the sexual orientation question was designed. So there was a lot of celebration about our new response options for gay, lesbian, bisexual, but there was less kind of commentary on what about queer people who don't fit into those boxes. What about the kind of the communities who were excluded in the design process from being counted in this seemingly inclusive exercise? So I think box breakers can play a key role in kind of exposing how the design of categories and classifications, it's all made up. It's all involving a designer making a call in terms of who's in, who's out. And I really want this book to be a rally cry for box breakers in terms of their power, both to kind of subvert and push against the boxes available, but also in their presence, in their incongruity, break the systems they're forced into.
Love that. I love that. I'm going to tease out another works example from you, because again, I think one of the beauties of this book is that the breadth of it is so wonderful in the sense that you're able to take these, and they're not necessarily complex ideas, but you work them through in ways that are so obvious when you read them and you think about them, but only through your writing. Tell me a little bit about the dating and desire chapter. That was my favourite one actually, but of course I'm going to say that because it was the tech one. But actually, because I think what you're doing is taking this idea of the more categories, which I think is often a celebrated idea, or at least something that's being pushed for, as you talk about, and you wonderfully showcase how this is actually very limiting and restricting desire, which is obviously not a thing we want to go for. So tell us a little bit about that chapter and how you kind of contest this idea that for many is actually quite an idea that's got sanctuary around it.
So I think it's chapter 2 of the book looks at dating apps and kind of technologies around digital desire. So how do apps like Tinder, Bumble, Field, how do they design the sexualities, the desires, the genders that are available to users? Kind of who decides whether we'll have 5 options, 10 options, whether it's single choice, multiple choice. I was just really interested in kind of seeing under the bonnet to see what's happening there. And my research into the kind of history of categories on dating apps opened up to me this really interesting pivot around late 2015, 2016, where something happened in the world, particularly in the US and the UK, where these large mainstream dating apps, so apps like Tinder, Bumble, realised something was wrong with their apps, that they weren't serving all the communities that they wished to reach. The CEOs put out statements, particularly for queer, trans, non-binary communities, apologising for the design of their apps, saying that we had got it wrong, our options were too narrow, too binary, but we're going to change something about what we do. So they kind of highlighted, and obviously these are capitalist, commercial kind of projects, they were probably thinking there's more money in it if we could kind of expand it to wider audiences, queer audiences in particular. So they said, okay, the problem is our apps have not captured these communities meaningfully. We have not provided enough options for people to explain their desires, their attractions, and their experiences. So rather than having, say, 5 sexualities, we're going to offer 10 or 15. We're going to add more and more options to these apps. And we see this across dating platforms, we see this on social media. Facebook was doing similar things around that time. And we celebrated as being this inclusive intervention, this response to historical exclusions. But actually, and my book is a little bit contrarian in some regards, I don't really kind of think it necessarily helped or did what it claimed to do. So under the surface, these tech systems were basically unchanged. So at the kind of high level, you're getting 15 options where you maybe got 5. But actually, behind the scenes, how stuff was aggregated, counted, how the data was used, didn't change a huge amount. And my work more broadly is a critique of this pivot, this kind of move to offer more and more categories for gender, sex, and sexuality. So don't get me wrong, having 2 options is far too narrow, far too binary, but also having 20 or 30 options doesn't necessarily improve the experiences of queer communities, whether it's dating app users, any other kind of group. What it does actually is often create more and more silos. It kind of fragments what could be collective experiences into quite narrow, individualistic accounts of who you are. So that chapter in particular is inspired by an amazing scholar in the US called Gemma Milne, who coined this term I wish I'd coined, called taxonomical renaissance. This idea that we're living through a moment for kind of all of these taxonomies where we're categorizing, we're counting, we're kind of splitting our identities into more and more smaller parts. And I think there are some risks about that in terms of collective, in terms of solidarity, in terms of kind of connecting with others. I don't necessarily believe just adding more and more options when the tech system or the platform remains unchanged necessarily is everyone's best interests.
So you mentioned there that you've been a bit contrarian in that chapter. I'm not sure you're being contrarian, but I do think that what you're putting out is perhaps in some sense a bit of a surprising, or could be surprising on first look, narrative, particularly this danger of inclusion, right? And particularly in this moment that we're in where things like DEI is super weaponized by the other people. I wonder how you think about kind of, I don't want to say taking back this narrative, but, or owning this narrative around challenging inclusion, but from an emancipatory perspective as opposed to a restrictive perspective, as I think it's done in other spaces. You know, you're only just launching the book, but how does it feel doing that in our current moment? How does it feel to be contrarian?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I also, and for the reviews, some of the reviews I've had about the book, they have been surprised. They picked up this book thinking this is going to be a kind of happy, celebratory, kind of Pride Month release, and then realised quite quickly it's quite critical of lots of assumptions we make about things like inclusion and recognition. But on writing the book, I didn't want to give that space to anti-trans campaign groups. I didn't want to let that entire narrative of critiques of inclusion, critiques of diversity, to be passed on to right-wing kind of anti-trans campaigners. There's a space for critical left-wing analysis of how do we do this type of work meaningfully, critically, how do we, and I mean, I've worked in DEI research and practice for about 10 years, and I've done a lot of these interventions, I've been leading a lot of these projects, and they do some good, but also it doesn't mean we can't be critical about the failures as well. And I think in this current political moment, there is this tension where, in terms of responding to the kind of ongoing onslaught against kind of trans, non-binary, queer communities, we take this defensive position where we end up having to defend everything around DEI work, around diversity, around inclusion, and I think that doesn't also help. So in my work, there are some DEI initiatives which probably should be cancelled, that should be abandoned, that aren't fit for purpose. But I think we all have the ability to kind of untangle what's actually meaningful, what's actually doing what it says it's doing, and what sorts of kind of DEI work, diversity initiatives are just performative or window dressing can be abandoned. So I hope this book provides a bit of a way to help navigate those differences and unpick kind of what's worth fighting for and what can be maybe just let slip away in this current moment.
What do you think is a fair counterpoint to your critique? I like asking people that when they put out an argument, because you have to think about everything that people are going to contest about an idea, particularly one that fits into a kind of zeitgeist, perhaps not the best zeitgeist, but a zeitgeist nonetheless. But what do you think is a more fair-spirited critique of what you're thinking? Or
that's a really good and tough question. There's probably something in, so the book looks at categories around gender, sex and sexuality, and ultimately argues that a lot of these categories are designed, they're constructed to serve certain purposes. But in writing the book, I'm also worried that that does play into certain assumptions about kind of sexuality being made up, being impressionable. There's one chapter in the book around dating apps which looks at actually can you become kind of more queer when you're interacting with queer categories on dating apps. I'm aware that does play into some of these long-standing tropes around the impressionability of particularly young people, young queer people. So there is a risk that in terms of the optics of the book could be picked up, translated, simplified to help the opponents of these movements. I think that's probably a communication point though, more so than the content of the book. But I think there's a hesitancy among kind of LGBTQ scholars or people doing this work to even touch on these issues, to even kind of touch on the idea that for some people they might be more gay because they came into contact with a film when they were 15 or 20 or so. But actually I think we need to have those discussions rather than shy away from them, and I hope the book kind of helps provide a way in a small part to kind of have those discussions.
I think it goes back to my point earlier that I said that you're very generous with the way that you write, but I think also in the way that you bring together existing ideas, right? You say within the book, and you said to me downstairs as well, you know, a lot of this is not new, lots of people have said this before me, and I'm trying to put this in a different way or put it in a different light, to not just gift that knowledge or gift these ideas or reframe them and remix them so that other people can get them, but also to bring those ideas out of these spaces that they're previously in. How do you why do you think that some of these ideas? I mean, we're both scholars in science technology studies, which doesn't really mean anything outside the academy really, but means something to us, and that's a very central idea around constructivism. This idea that science technology is constructed by the social, and the social is constructed by science technology, and they're intimately interwoven, and so is everything else, right? That's kind of sits at the heart of this discipline. And in some ways it's a very obvious idea, and it's been said by many, many people, but you put it in a different context, and it's entirely new, and it means something new to different people. So how do you think about that? Why these ideas perhaps are not always making it out in the way that they were intended to the audiences that perhaps they could actually be useful for, personally or in an activist sense?
Yeah, so that's something I hope to achieve with the book is some of the ideas are not new, been around 20, 30 years, but there's a translation exercise here. There's something about taking some of these core concepts from fields like science and technology studies, from sociology, and translating them in ways for data practitioners, data scientists, DEI workers, activists, campaigners, kind of that translation exercise. But for me it was really surprising. So one of the key ideas in the book is about the kind of back and forth between categories and those who are assigned a category. So kind of as a gay man, there's a category of gay man, what's the back and forth between the category and the person? And I was really surprised that this kind of idea of this back and forth, this kind of looping effects of categories, had not really translated into how people are doing kind of diversity and inclusion work within organizations, within companies. People were speaking about categories of gay, bisexual, man, woman, as if they were these like natural artifacts that had always existed, that will always exist, that were not kind of, had no interaction with the world around them. And I just find that so bizarre that these very kind of professional, well-established, senior practitioners, people working in the industry, had not come across this kind of academic work. So with the book and this particular focus on these kind of circular categories, these kind of looping effects, this back and forth between categories and those categorized, one takeaway I hope is that somebody picks up the book, they may be designing a census, maybe a civil servant working for the Scottish Government, they pick this up and they go, actually, there's more to it than meets the eye. Or particularly the media, maybe a journalist who thinks he just presents kind of the category of women as this kind of solid, frozen in time concept. Actually, a quick read of some fairly basic science and technology studies, and you'll start to realise, actually, it's far more kind of multi-layered, far more complex, but can be explained in, I hope, a super simple, super accessible way as well.
One of the other areas that you draw on a lot in the book is queer theory, right? And one of the, if I'm by no means an expert on queer theory, and I wouldn't dare pretend to be, but one of the things that I really like and appreciate that's utilised a lot in queer theory is this kind of redescribing, reclaiming, taking something out of context and making you think about it in an entirely different way. And it reminds me a lot of the kind of core idea of what's behind a lot of sociology, which is making the familiar strange and stranging things in order to understand them better. So, I mean, you have so many examples of this in the book. I mean, you look at the closet and you talk about it as an information management system. I mean, that's brilliant. You're funny throughout it. You know, you've got, even in just the intro, you've got things like straight expectations and category is. I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it means to try and to take these ideas and remix them, reclaim them. Is it possible to reclaim these? Do we need something different here? I mean, how do we try and attack this and change this so that it really does resonate in a different kind of way?
Yeah, so I was trying to think of a really academic answer, but my answer is not going to be academic at all. I guess I'm inspired hugely by the work of Sarah Ahmed and her ability to kind of create these really sticky concepts. So something like a kind of feminist killjoy, these kind of really sticky ideas that stick with the reader, stick with the audience for a long time. And in the book, I have tried my hand, throwing some of the stuff at the wall, seeing what sticks. But just, I want these kind of ideas that resonate, that hang around, that maybe don't do anything radically new, but they are maybe repurposed and repackaged in a way that creates those light bulb moments for readers. And I know myself when I'm reading some of my favourite writers, scholars, activists, that ability to write and you just have that kind of light bulb idea where the kind of the dots join up and it kind of all clicks. So I hope that, particularly the stuff around the closet in this kind of the analogy of an information management system, I hope that it maybe just creates those kind of sticky moments for some readers. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, even that, like, I think just taking two different concepts and putting them together and creating this kind of interaction is exactly what I think is helping reframe some, they're not old ideas, but they're new ideas as they're remixed. I want to talk a little bit about solutions, because of course, what is a critique without an offered solution? And you address this quite a lot in the book, this idea of techno fixes or interventions that are not kind of doing the work, initiatives, laws, infrastructures, and so on and so forth that are presented as solutions that are not. Reformist reformations, I think, is the term that you're using or you're taking. Okay, we kind of know a lot about this idea of techno-solutionism and putting in things that are not exactly answering the question. So what does answer this question? How do we make change beyond just making familiar strange, beyond just pointing out? What are your ideas about how we can think about actual emancipation, actual inclusion, when it comes to thinking about how people are counted or not?
Yeah, so I'm sure this is going to be a question we'll be asked a lot, kind of I highlight a lot of critiques, a lot of issues, how do we go about fixing them? So I've no single solution, you'll be surprised to hear, but I do in the final kind of sections of the book highlight kind of a two-strand approach. So the first strand is kind of short, medium term, like what can we go out and do now to try and push back against some of these kind of harmful classification practices, some of these kind of categories, these data systems, these policies which are trying to count and categorize us in ways that don't reflect or represent who we are. So my kind of thing we can do very quickly is kind of throw stuff into the classification machine, slow it down, impede it. I kind of conclude the book by saying like sticks, debris, stones, stuff just to kind of slow down this kind of ever-expanding need to count and categorize our experiences, our sexualities, our desires in a variety of ways. When we slow down the machine, when we're kind of getting to a speed where it's not increasingly getting bigger and bigger, more expansive, we can then think about what next, what might follow in the wake of our current approach to categories and classifications. So I do finish the book in a somewhat trying to provide a blueprint or a map. I have 5 kind of ways forward. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but the one I want to spotlight returns to the idea you kind of asked about at the start, and that's the idea of box breakers. So actually, in our design of whether you're designing a survey, your work, whether you're working for a dating app, designing new kind of sexualities and desires, if you actually center those box breakers in your design, if you begin there and build from there, then the data system, the classification system you build is always going to be far more inclusive, far more effective, far less likely for those people to fall between those categorical cracks. So by centering those who are going to be outside the kind of realm of kind of comprehension or the realm of those neat, tidy drop-down boxes and categories, from there we might be able to build a more kind of meaningful classification system. I guess the book also begs the question, can we exist in a world without categories and classifications? Is it like some kind of human nature for us to always sort each other according to shared and different qualities? I don't know if that world is possible. I don't know if I'll see that world in my lifetime. But in the kind of medium term, how can we work with these categories in ways that are less harmful, that are less kind of likely to assign people to groups where they are basically demoted as meaningless, as unvaluable? And I think by centering the box breakers is one way, perhaps, of doing that.
I've got 2 more questions, and then we'll go to the audience, so this is your heads up to get your questions ready for when I come to you. I really enjoy, I've forgotten the lady's name, I apologise for that, the lady that you reference quite a few times in the book, but particularly in the conclusion, you come back to your interview with this worker who works with various different kinds of inclusive data. And she says at one point, it's one thing to ask, what gender are you? It's another to say, do you feel safe? And I thought that was a really interesting provocation in terms of what is it that we're actually asking people to disclose here? What is it? What is the question and why? And I wondered if you could, if there were other questions that you thought might be alternative questions, and I know they'll differ depending on the context, of course. But I just thought that was such a powerful way of showcasing the flaw in asking these kind of questions in different spaces. So give us some more questions that you'd like people to ask.
Yeah, okay, so I've not rehearsed this at all, so I'm going to kind of off the top of my head. So you're speaking about the final chapter, an amazing interview with Rima, who works as a data professional, and this idea about kind of safety or capturing data about actually what you're trying to investigate. So if you're asking about workplace inclusion rather than asking are you gay, lesbian, man, woman, actually maybe a question about safety could fit that. And I think more broadly this idea of kind of we're caught in a situation where we're designing data systems, categories and classifications in this very top-down approach. So in the book I'm also inspired by the work of a US scholar called Paisley Curra, who wrote an amazing book called Sex Is As Sex Does a couple of years ago, and really kind of flips the script on what sex data or sex categories do. So in the book, Curra writes about how actually the question you might ask about sex might differ if you're applying for a driving license than if you're getting on a plane, or if you're being kind of registered to go into hospital. Again, you might have a different sex question. You might have a different sex question if you're being taken into prison. Again, these different contexts might actually require different questions about gender, sex, and sexuality, and that's not a problem. I think we're in this bizarre headspace, particularly in Scotland and the UK right now, where conversations about data, about categories, are all about harmonisation. They're all about standardisation. It's all about having one single neat and tidy suite of questions that work in all spaces and places. But that does not reflect the reality of the world we live in, where actually your gender, your sex, your sexuality has a different meaning on a dating app than it does in a business context or if you're reporting a hate crime to the police. So in terms of the questions I would ask, I'm not going to provide a specific question, but it would be that kind of contextualness. Actually, like 101 for a researcher, ask the question about what you're trying to gather information about. Don't do it the other way around, where we're having these large kind of reviews, these large top-down reports on trying to arrive at that single sex and gender question. That's never going to work, because people are always going to fall between the cracks. So be contextual, capture information about what you're trying to investigate, and abandon the words of data harmonization, data standardization. Actually, data should be messy, it should be complex, it should be nuanced, and it should be context specific.
My final question, and I think part of this as well, when we're talking about questions and the idea of disclosure, why are we not disclosing why we're asking a question as opposed to asking someone who you're asking a question to disclose something to you. So as to practice that, I am asking this question both for my own curiosity, but also because I want to give you an opportunity to market yourself to all these wonderful people. What's next for you? What are you working on now? I know that you're probably working on promoting this book, but you've always got other projects up your sleeve, so I want to know about that.
I can confidently say I'm not writing a new book. That is not on the horizon anytime soon. This book was more difficult than queer data. I don't know if it's just about, I wrote queer data during lockdown. I was furloughed from my work. I was this horrible cliche of somebody who was very productive for some of the time writing a book. This book was a bit of a slog. This book didn't come as easily. And when I finished it, I'm like, I never said never again, but I'm like, I'm taking a break from writing a book for a while. But also, I think what I want to do with the book is use this as a way in, particularly to companies, to organisations, to governments. I'm sure I'll do some kind of academic talks and talks with universities, but that's not the key audience of this book. The key audience are people arriving to these ideas who are new, who are maybe unfamiliar, who are looking for a kind of an accessible text with a jazzy cover where they can kind of have those kind of light bulb ideas. So I'm going to be doing a lot of kind of events with industry, with government, with people who can affect real change in terms of how these categories, how these classifications are enacted in the real world. And one way I'm planning to do that is, as you mentioned in your kind of little bio, the Gender and Sexuality Data Lab, which launched at the University of Edinburgh in January this year. So that is currently quite a small little hub within the university, but hoping to grow that slowly, grow that organically, and use that also as a kind of a means to bring together people who are working with these questions across a range of spaces and places. So you might be doing campaign work, you might be doing a kind of creative practice around it, to bring folk together who are interested in kind of queer categories, queering categorization, and thinking how can we do this in ways that actually brings about actionable change. I'm less interested in the kind of theoretical developments. I'm more interested in how can we take this book and ensure that the next census does a better job than the last census, or how can we take this book and change how LGBTQ asylum cases are being reviewed by the Home Office. Those real practical translations of these ideas into real world situations. So that's my hope over the next few years with the book. More action, less writing.
So, not busy at all. Okay, good. I'd love to turn to all of you now to give you the opportunity to quiz Kevin on this wonderful intervention. If you ask your question, I'll repeat it so that anyone who's listening in from online hopefully can hear it through the microphone loud and clear. So just stick up your hand and ask away or comment away. Who would like to go first? Come on, be bold. Yes, you at the back.
Hi, thanks so much, Kevin. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I just have been reflecting as you've been discussing this, and it occurs to me, one thing that I felt, I don't know if this is more general than just my own experience, but I felt like we had a moment a few years ago. It was during the pandemic, it was during the kind of Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, when a lot of people were upset about, whatever, and minority interests in particular were being highlighted and EDI initiatives were exploding. And it feels a bit like that moment has passed now. And I don't know how much of that is just like George Floyd's Black Lives Matter dying down a bit, or like Twitter, no one using Twitter anymore or something. But what do you make of this sort of the changes in the last few years from that kind of peak of interest in these kind of topics?
To repeat for people online, the person at the back asked a question about how there seemed to be a kind of peak of interest of minority interests and topics, particularly during the pandemic, particularly thinking about things like Black Lives Matter and incidents around George Floyd and so on and so forth, how that had a real sort of moment, as it were, and it feels a little bit like that moment's passed, and we're having different kind of conversations now, perhaps attributing to the death of Twitter. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I totally agree with your assessment. Like, that's my impression. So as mentioned, I've done a lot of kind of diversity inclusion work over the past 10 years, both in kind of education, but also in kind of industry as well. And it's really strange to be doing this work and realise how much in a worse place we are now than when I started doing this work around 2015, 2016. So my work particularly was around designing gender, sex and sexuality questions, and the kind of it's kind of almost a weird headspace to be in, that there was a possibility we might have had non-binary sex as a option in the census, for example. That was something that was very much on the table in the late 2010s. The general openness to kind of thinking that these questions will always get more inclusive, more diverse, more open, and then this total U-turn we've seen in the past few years, where our approach to categorization, to classification, has just gone in this bizarre kind of backwards direction, where we're now this media fixation with kind of the category of women, this very biological essentialism we're seeing across categories, across classifications. So I can't explain the turn, I can't explain why that's happened, but I also know this is a moment, this moment will pass. And I think, going back to the previous point I was trying to make, we need to ensure that when this moment does pass, we haven't been holding on to things which were never fit for purpose. So as you highlight around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, there were some amazing initiatives that came out of it. There was also a huge amount of pointless, performative, theatrical initiatives which did those communities no good at all. It might have helped corporate companies, it might have looked good on social media, but actually changing people's material conditions, it did nothing to help. So again, when this moment passes, make sure we're holding on to the right things, and we're able to have that kind of critical attention to what we can leave behind when this moment kind of passes as well.
Who's next? I'd like to ask a question. Yes. So for the people at the back and also for those online, this person asked about, I guess, definition of data, thinking not just about ticking boxes, but also qualitative data. If you're asked, for instance, gender and writing an essay underneath that, what's that really mean when we're talking about these ideas of categorization?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. And something which was a real challenge for this book was I didn't want to write Queer Data 2.0. So with this book, I have tried to foreground ideas about categories, classifications, and labels, which I think are very interrelated and interwoven with data. So how you design a data point is based on kind of deciding what a category is, whether the borders of that category are porous, whether the category is exclusive, whether you can select one or multiple categories. But in your question also, I love this idea of qualitative data. So I haven't spoken much about qualitative data. The book actually doesn't speak much about qualitative data, but that is actually my background in terms of my research, my work is doing kind of work with qualitative data. And you're right, there's a huge amount of potential to kind of liberate ideas, experiences through qualitative data techniques. So you mentioned kind of writing boxes in something like a survey or a census. Actually, if those kind of data points are used meaningfully, there's a huge amount of potential in analysing what people put into a writing box. Actually, how do you analyse somebody's sexuality in a census if it's a writing option? I'm also really invested in this big idea I have, which I'll briefly say, on this kind of future model of diversity monitoring. So diversity monitoring takes up a lot of my work. I work in a business school right now. It's how do you design the 9 questions you're asked in a survey when you start a new job or you enroll in an organisation. And it's really one-dimensional. It's really it's been around since the Equality Act. It's been around kind of 20 years now. Like, it hasn't changed much as well, and I think there are far more exciting ways we could be capturing information about identity beyond this 2-dimensional diversity monitoring form. So my grand idea, if anybody wants to kind of provide funding or anything, is to design some kind of like 3-dimensional diversity monitoring form where actually you go into this kind of 3-dimensional space and you're selecting a gender, a sexuality, a religion, a belief. All of these things are moving around, nothing is fixed, everything is kind of interwoven. I think that would reflect people's experiences far more than these 9 distinct siloed questions. So I think the technology exists to do that. I don't think HR teams are going to be enthusiastic about embedding these 3-dimensional diversity monitoring forms, but actually what kind of experiences and lives would that open up? Actually, how would that totally destabilise our ideas about the category of gay, of lesbian, of queer? Actually, it would just throw everything up in the air and create, I think, really exciting potentials. So, yeah, that's my grand idea. Let's see if I'm able to do it.
There's something also in that, if I may, as the chair's privilege, there's something in that about for those who perceive themselves as having obvious categories, what that would throw up, being put into a space where you suddenly have these, I don't know if you're imagining it,
I'm imagining everything moving around, yeah.
VR headset thing that you go into, whatever. But if you're used to ticking, white Scottish female as I am, what does that look like for you when you're suddenly questioned in other ways? And I think that's a kind of standard argument that's made in a lot of queer works. I'm thinking, for instance, transgender issue by Sean Fay. A big part of their argument is this is about emancipation for all and being able to remove that kind of limits of these categories for everybody. Just thought to add that in there. Yes, yourself.
What advice would you give to someone who works within sort of these groups that are adamantly sticking to these quantitative, reductive kind of categories and are kind of trying to push against these thoughts? What advice would you give someone on that?
So the question was, what advice would I give to somebody working in an organisation where they might have really kind of progressive, innovative ideas about identity data, diversity data, but they're pushing against maybe senior leaders who just want the standard numerical quantitative data? How do we kind of push against that? That's really been my mission the past few years, both with Queer Data and Rainbow Track, to kind of to change the hearts and minds of that group, those people who are in often very powerful positions, making really important decisions about data, about who counts, who's in, who's out. But often these people don't know a huge amount about what they're doing. So in queer data, I write about this idea of queer data competence, and actually, and this kind of came out of my research into the census in Scotland, where a lot of people in very powerful positions who were making the call in terms of how do we capture information about trans communities, how many sexualities do we have, many of these people had no idea what they were doing. They were in very senior positions, but they didn't know anything about, I mean, some people admitted on record they only knew what the word cisgender was a few weeks before actually designing a question on cisgender. So I think trying to kind of enhance that competence, so whether it's lived experience or expertise is one way of doing it. I'd love also a model where people become aware of what they don't know. So I'm really surprised when I do a lot of kind of, lots of meetings about how do we design questions on gender, sex and sexuality. And I'm often surprised by people's willingness to disclose how little they know about the topic that they've been tasked to lead on. So they've been asked to commission this huge government project designing new questions on gender, sex and sexuality, and they'll say to me in the meeting, I read a few blogs online, I've looked at the Wikipedia page, I think I'm ready to go. And does a real disservice to people who have been living, studying, breathing this for decades. And I think to myself, like, I know nothing about, I don't know, fixing an aeroplane. I wouldn't go to the airport and think, I'll read a few blogs, I can then kind of get in there and do the job. But there's something about designing data, designing questions around identity, where there's kind of gung-ho attitude. So if we can find a way to push back against that, and at the very least help people become aware of how little they know about the topic, because they might then recuse themselves, they might then step back and go, actually, I know nothing about this, but I have a colleague who knows a lot about this, they're far better to be doing this work. So I think that kind of self-awareness of how little they might know might be one way to kind of get around that issue as well.
Or get in touch with the University of Edinburgh Data and Sexuality Lab. They have lots of great initiatives that can help. I don't even work for them. But, did you have a question? Did you have your hand up? No, I'm sorry, I thought you did. Yes. Oh, from online. Brilliant.
Yeah. So this is from Leah Lockhart. Kevin, a long time ago, you talked to me about fathomability, and it has stuck with me. If someone in an institution collects and holds data about people they don't know in their own lives, how can data help them fathom that person and their humanity? What kinds of things do we need to happen around data collection to help people see and fathom each other? You kind of started to answer that, I guess.
Do you want to repeat? Do we need to repeat that?
No, that's all good.
Already?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So fathomability, big word. I kind of use it to describe, I'll kind of give a bit of context to how I came to that idea. So I speak a lot about it, but I was really interested in the census, in the design of sexual orientation questions, and how the inclusion of response options on lesbian, gay, bisexual was non-controversial. There was very little, if any, media pushback, no outrage around having a question on sexual orientation and having those response options. But when it was revealed that the census in the kind of write-in box, so to go back to an earlier question, the write-in box would have some predictive text answers that when you started typing in P-O-L-Y, polysexual would come up, pansexual, queer, some other sexualities. These were ridiculed in the media. They were ultimately taken out of that technology was stripped out of the census. And for me, it kind of highlighted this two-tier view to kind of queer communities, the sense of if you're kind of fathomable or comprehensible to the mainstream, cisgender, straight population, then great. You can be included, you can be counted, you can be brought in. But if you're anything that sits outside of their own worldview, then you're ridiculed, you're seen as being not a real sexuality, not a real desire, not a real identity. You're not fathomable, you don't count. So you're not even a race, you're not even excluded, you're in a different realm, you're not even comprehensible to the person designing those categories. So for me, and the book speaks a lot to that around this kind of, it's an aspect of the rainbow trap as well, the sense of you can be included, you can be counted, as long as your identity is fathomable or comprehensible to the majority straight population. If not, then tough luck, you're going to be excluded from these inclusive interventions because you don't make sense to us. And that's just a really poor form of inclusion. It's not inclusion in any meaningful sense. And I think we see that a lot in a lot of current DEI initiatives. In Scotland, in the UK, there's kind of partial version of inclusion, but it's very much designed and driven by people who are not reflecting their own lived or their kind of own life experience.
Thank you for that question. Yes.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I think historically the census has been used as like a tool of control, right, for state legibility of its citizenry. I come from Indonesia where there are a lot of people who only have first names and no last names, and the last names were imposed by the Dutch colonial rule so that they'd be able to tax us better, so that they'd be able to, trace a lineage of like enclosure essentially, right, and passing down that property. So I'm wondering if you see a benefit to incomprehensibility, a benefit to illegibility, especially when it comes to the state using legibility as a system of control.
Well, great question. How to summarise? The asker was asking about the idea of the state using legibility as a form of control, a tool of control, and whether there's a benefit in a sense of incomprehensibility or perhaps hiddenness in not being able to be fathomable.
Yeah, definitely. Fantastic question. Thank you. And yeah, it was, I think for me, there was a real driving force, a real impulse to write the book, because I was surprised when I was doing these talks around queer data, when I was going out doing stuff around the census in Scotland, the UK. It was surprising to see how enthusiastic people were about sharing their data with the state. This kind of disconnect between the dangers and the potential benefits. And particularly as the first chapter of the book looks at the police. It looks at hate crime reporting, and this huge expansion, this huge datafication of hate crime, both in Scotland and the UK, and this turn to capture more and more information about queer communities, about their kind of what they're doing day to day, where they're going, who they're seeing, feeding all this data into the police, and kind of overlooking this really problematic history between these communities and things like the state and the police. And I just kind of thought, we're getting swept up here in this drive to being visible, to being counted, to being included. I think we just need to pause and think, actually, in some situations, not having a record that says you're trans, or not having a file in the government with your sexuality on it, might actually make your kind of, in terms of safety, in terms of reducing risk of harm, might make it all the safer. And I wrote this book, I finished writing it probably like last summer, so about a year ago. And since then, we've seen what's been happening in the US, which is a really clear example of this quick pivot, particularly among kind of mainstream LGBTQ orgs in the US, where quickly realizing actually maybe we don't want to be kind of capturing more and more data, particularly about the trans population in the context of the US, and how quickly that can turn. So my concern about things like the census is that although it seems relatively safe to give that data to the state right now, we have no idea what will happen with it in 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years' time. So again, just that caution and that kind of care about data, and just thinking through the potential risks and benefits, and not feeling like recusing yourself or stepping out is a kind of passive choice, but actually it is an active decision to not be counted. It is an active decision to tick the prefer not to say box, to tick the wrong answer. All of these are active choices, and I think they should be recognised more meaningfully for that kind of the response to the current situation that we're in.
Probably time for one or two more questions. Oh, you've got one online? No? Oh, just one more question you're saying. Okay, one more question. Who would like the honour of Kevin's final question this evening, or does it land with me? Yes, go for it.
Do you think that that in itself actually ever have that positive impact in society or communities that are not able to make us see rather than others and helping these us, for example, maybe pioneers in trauma and ideas around classification and that in the way that they have manifested themselves in society.
Love that. So for everyone online and those at the back, the question was, do you think data can ever, realise its potential and achieve its promise, specifically for minoritized communities? You were talking specifically about the queer community, and can minoritized communities or queer communities be sort of leaders or pioneers when it comes to sort of decolonising ideas around the promise that data has. Hopefully that's a good summary.
Thank you, and thank you so much for ending the event on a positive note. I can have a really positive, upbeat answer here. Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There are definitely benefits in some spaces to being counted, to being seen. And I think, again, an example like something like a census or a survey in your workplace, that kind of the consciousness raising around the actual doing of that exercise, I think, has potential benefits. So what I mean by that is when you are asked a question about sexual orientation in your work, or you get the census through the door and you're asked whether you're trans or not, there is something that can actually open people to reflect on who they are, to kind of maybe awaken ideas that they never thought about before. I've been really humbled after the census in Scotland to receive some emails from people who actually came out after completing the census because for the first time they had stopped, they paused, they'd actually reflected on their sexuality, on their gender, and thought, actually, I'm not who I always thought I was. And it's amazing that completing a data exercise, completing a survey, had that ability to kind of redirect the course of somebody's life, potentially. And I think that's a real potential positive. In terms of the kind of decolonisation of data as well, my second kind of grand idea, aside from the three-dimensional diversity monitoring form, is actually building on work from kind of indigenous data groups in the US who've done an amazing amount of work to kind of control their data, not just in terms of having somebody on the group who's designing the questions, but actually having servers, computers, all of the kind of infrastructure we use to capture information about data, having that in their control. And I think, what could we learn if queer communities were able to do that? If we had our queer server, where we had our census records on that machine, rather than a government kind of server. So thinking at that, even that technical level, how we can control the data, and how, as you're highlighting, there's a huge amount of potentials, a huge amount of kind of liberatory potentials in that. How we do it, I don't know, but we can learn from other minoritized groups who are doing very similar work in this space.
Wonderful point to end on, the queer server. Let's build it. Please join me in giving a huge congratulatory for launching his book, and a huge thank you for sharing all of your candid ideas with us. Round of applause for Kevin.